Today on Locked On Women's Basketball, we talk to Sabreena Merchant of The Athletic about their new podcast, No Offseason, and then get into a few things regarding March Madness and the WNBA season. This is Locked On Women's Basketball, presented by Monarch Money.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm Chelsea Lay, and I am joined by Sabreena Merchant of The Athletic, and we have a bunch of exciting things to talk about. But to start, we're going to talk about The Athletic's new women's basketball show, or I guess revamped women's basketball show called No Offseason, with you and Zenekada, Chantel Jennings, and Ben Pickman, which is super exciting. And I think just kind of lends into the idea that, there is no off season with women's basketball these days. And it's exciting to have in-depth coverage all year round. So definitely exciting. I've been listening to the few episodes that have happened since you guys, launched the revamp. But when it comes to, deciding to make this switch and to kind of regenerate or rejuvenate the Athletics women's basketball coverage, what was the motivation behind this kind of rebrand?
Yeah, first things first, thanks for having me on, Chelsea. Obviously, big fan of Locked On Women's Basketball, so appreciate the invites. As far as the podcast, we've had the Athletic Women's Basketball show essentially since September of 2023, and we're really happy with how that show did. We launched basically during the WNBA playoffs that year, got to cover a very fun finals between Vegas and New York, and ended up going through the next college regular season, which, admittedly had its peak during the NCAA tournament, as a lot of things did that time of year. But it just sort of became clear that while we were really proud of the work we were doing, it made sense for the company to invest more effort into what we were doing, because women's basketball is such an important space. And, we have jobs as writers too. So we needed a little bit more, support all around in terms of production. And they've added video, which is, pros and cons. You gotta look nice, but video is always good for the people. The YouTube channel is starting to pop. So the name No Offseason comes from a project that we had at The Athletic actually back in 2022, 2023, that WNBA offseason, when Ben Pickman, one of my co-writers, actually got to go to Europe and embed himself with a lot of WNBA players during their off seasons, but not really their off seasons because they were still playing. And I got to spend time in the US talking about Athletes Unlimited and players who were going back to their alma maters and, playing 3x3, and you can decide who won that sort of assignment lottery. But it's still, part of the DNA of what we do at The Athletic is covering the game all year round. And when it came time to, sort of rebranding the show and giving it a big boost coming into this year's March Madness, it seemed like the perfect name to just, go with what we've already accomplished at The Athletic and encapsulate the never stoppingness of women's basketball.
No, and I feel like, especially now with things like Unrivaled being stateside and, the NCAA just continuing to grow, even in this post Caitlin Clark era, I think, it's such a thing that people say all the time. So I'm glad that, you guys have kind of capitalized on the name, and it's something that people will recognize and be able to relate with. It's kind of a colloquial saying that people say all the time, there's no WNBA off season. So it's really exciting. And I mean, I know obviously you were having you had this podcast before, in a different sense, but if you were to say the new mission statement of No Off Season, what do you think you would say?
I think it's bringing, just insightful, candid conversations about the sport and with some of its major people. We have a lot of interviews with some of the biggest names in women's college basketball. Leading into the launch, we had shows with Gina Auriemma and, Tara Vanderveer was one of our guests this last week, and Asia Wilson and Sabreena Escu had been on the pod. So the people that you want to hear from, and also the people that I hope you want to hear from, and analyzing all of that, all of that put together.
Yeah, of course. And obviously with the NBA, there's round season in-depth coverage. And I know your podcast is only a few times a week, but what do you think would change about the women's basketball landscape if there was investment into that constant, in-depth, year-round coverage like, things like the NBA has?
I think it would just allow us to cover so much more, when you think about the jobs that we have, like there are three of us national women's basketball writers at The Athletic, and I'm very grateful that there are three of us at The Athletic, but that also means that there's an entire college season, an entire WNBA season that have to be accomplished with three people. So yeah, we tend to hit a lot of the big stuff first, and I would love to get into, why William and Mary was such a fun 16 seed in this year's tournament, but I don't really have the time to do that. And like why, the Oregon State run was something we really should have been paying attention to after everything that happened last year. And, I think more dedicated coverage, more resources, more support just allows us to tell more stories. And all of the stories we tell are already so fun and so heartwarming and, really resonate with people. And I think, how could you say no to more of that?
Yeah, of course. And I think something, obviously that we know about the WNBA is that, players tend to stay with teams as long as they can. The special thing about the women's college side is that you do end up being able to build those, I guess, like relationships or build that fandom with women's college basketball players because they stay in college for 3 to 4 years. And I mean, the transfer portal kind of has changed how players stay with specific teams, gives us this opportunity to be able to go in depth a bit more and be able to build those relationships between like, us as writers and, podcasters and et cetera, and the players before they even get to the WNBA. And so I think there's such an opportunity there to like grow the game in a way that media may just be starting to tap into, but not fully tap into in the way that we see in men's basketball. And I think that is such like a stark difference between men's and women's basketball because, a lot of these men's college players come into the NBA and, you haven't really had time to fall in love with them or to see how they play. And their game is so, still new and raw because they've only played one season. So yeah, it's definitely an opportunity that I think you guys are kind of trying to do as much as you can with the resources that you're given. And I mean, there's so much more women's basketball media now, but I do really enjoy the fact that you have, your three writers that are on the beat and you're taking this podcast to be able to kind of bring that coverage into media, but also bring the people who are listening to your podcast back to writing, which I think is, I mean, I'm biased because I'm also a writer. So, I'm like, I think writing is so important, but yeah, I mean, what do you think that like the space as we have it now is currently like lacking other than the things that we've already mentioned? And what do you hope to like bring to fill those gaps with your new podcast?
I think one of the fun things about the podcast is we get to spend time sort of sharing the details that don't make the stories that we write. Like you've been here, you report a story and you find like all of these fun anecdotes, and then it's just hard to put them all into, the process of writing something out because it doesn't all just fit all together. And that's the nice thing about the podcast is I get to talk about like, oh, I had this conversation with so-and-so and they said something really funny, but it, there wasn't a way to get it here. So it's like another little nugget for super fans of The Athletic, right? Get to find out about just more of the reporting we do. And I'm very grateful to The Athletic who lets us be on site for so many of the things that we cover. And there are just experiences and, little behind the scenes notes that you pick up when you're at something. And again, like those are things that we get to share on the podcast. So I'm just excited to like have another space that again, where like, all I have to do is just come and talk. I don't have to worry about like production or anything anymore, like, writing titles and headlines and things like that. And there's just more of an outlet for us to share all the work that we get to do and connect with the readers and the listeners of The Athletic. And, I think media companies around the country are realizing that there's a great ROI on women's basketball content. Like people want it, they're seeking it out. And if it's good, they will keep coming back to it. And, I think our company has realized that. And that's why they've put all this effort into, making us a bigger name on the Athletic podcast space. So, I'm sure people like everywhere in the media space have realized that if you want to bring people, fans, viewers, listeners, women's basketball is a place that like they're dying to seek out content and they're dying to listen and read and just engage in any way possible. So yeah, it's just good business, I think.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. And I think something that's really special about the women's basketball community is it's such like a passionate community, and like we see it with fans all the time. Like they will travel, they will support, they will read. So yeah, you're exactly right. It's good business to invest in that. So coming up next on Locked On Women's Basketball, we talked to Sabreena Merchant of The Athletic about March Madness, her predictions, and how the unfortunate JuJu Watkins injury will affect the rest of the tournament. Stay tuned. This is Locked On Women's Basketball. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery, and now I budget smarter and save more. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. We're going to kind of switch gears here a little bit and talk about March Madness. Today, Tuesday, we officially have our Sweet 16 locked in. It is kind of like a sad-ish vibe going around this morning when we think about the women's college basketball space because of the injury to JuJu Watkins. So if anybody's listening that hasn't heard the news, JuJu Watkins suffered a torn ACL last night in USC's round of 32 game against Mississippi State. And so obviously she will miss the rest of the tournament and probably most of next year as well, if not all of next year. So, that's kind of the biggest story going into the Sweet 16. And I was listening to the No Offseason preview of March Madness last week where, you were making your picks and, trying to see, which team could kind of break through this, I guess, like Elite Eight kind of, that's kind of like where the good teams need to be at their best instead of just playing to get through, whatever lower seed they are assigned. But, with JuJu now being out, does this change your projection of, say your bracket or just your thoughts of how the rest of the tournament's going to go?
Yeah, first things first, it's just horribly sad and depressing, and wishing all the best to JuJu and people around her to just make sure that she has everything she needs during her recovery, and hopefully this is not the last that we've seen of peak JuJu Watkins in a USC uniform. But I think this was a fairly wide open tournament field when it was announced, and throughout much of the regular season there was an expectation that at least 5 or 6 teams could realistically compete for a national title. And I think USC is probably not one of those teams anymore. I hate to discount a team that's clearly going through something, and honestly looked very, very impressive without JuJu Watkins in the lineup yesterday. Kiki Iriafen is about as good of a second banana as you can get in any team across the country. And if she's your best player, you're still doing okay. She has the ability to rise to number one option, but there is just a little bit, less talent on that team. There's that magic missing without JuJu Watkins. And, that means that there's probably 4 to 5 teams that can win a national title now. And I think the field is still fairly open, UCLA, Texas, South Carolina, UConn, maybe Notre Dame, maybe TCU. There's a lot of teams that still have an opportunity to go out to Tampa and win this thing. So I think the parity still exists. There's still a lot of matchups to be really excited about. Unfortunately, one of them is not the Elite Eight in the Spokane 4 regional, but I think there is still a lot to look forward to in this tournament.
Of course.
But, especially being in LA and having a lot of USC fans in my life, it is kind of a downer right now. And the atmosphere in the Galen Center was just one of the weirdest places I've ever watched a basketball game last night.
Oh.
But
you could tell,
you could tell. Hopefully there is a way to turn the page, at least for this USC team, which has so many seniors who are playing out their college careers right now. And just for the tournament as a whole, I know there was a lot riding on JuJu to sort of deliver as the next big scoring guard, her rivalry with Paige, sort of the heir apparent to what we'd seen in the last couple of years with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. And, they did get to play in the tournament once, so I'm happy for that.
Yeah, exactly. That game last year was great. But yeah, and I mean, again, it's just devastating to think about, not only like her like having to go through like what is a devastating injury and recovery and being out for such a long time, but I do think there is upside when you think about someone like Paige Bueckers, who kind of went through the same thing around the same time. Like, Paige missed her entire junior season with the same injury and now is back to playing, the same, if not better than she did before. So, I mean, there's hope in that sense. But I pulled up a really interesting stat this morning that said that only, I think it was about 35%. Let me just make sure. So yeah, 35% of participants in sports science studies and research are women. And so that kind of doesn't account for the kind of physiological differences that women's athletes are going through as opposed to men's athletes. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are, like what, other than just doing more base research, but like, is there a need to change the way that we approach women's athletes in terms of training to try and prevent things like this?
I think it starts with the research. I mean, there are numbers that show that, like, I know that some research has been done with soccer players, like their female soccer players are, I think, 2 to 4x more likely to tear their ACLs than men's soccer players. You mentioned Paige. Unfortunately, there's a very long list of college stars that JuJu can, compare herself to their situations. You're thinking about like Olivia Miles, who tore her ACL and missed that tournament, and then the subsequent next season, Elizabeth Kitley missed her final tournament. AZ Fudd tore her ACL last year. Like Ashlyn Watkins tore her ACL this year, incidentally against Mississippi State as well. There's too many that we can compare to, and like I literally keep a doc of just women's basketball ACL tears because I want to track recovery times and see like what sort of we're dealing with at this point. And there've been players who go through it and they're able to come back on the other side. Like Rory Harmon's had a really nice season for Texas. Kiki Dean tore her ACL early last year and has been really good for Ole Miss. I mean, obviously Paige playing better than ever, but it's never something you want to go through. Obviously, I'm sure JuJu Watkins would much rather be just living this tournament dream with her USC teammates, and to have to go through that sucks. There's really no other word for it, and it sucks for USC. It sucks for JuJu. It sucks for all of the LA fans who are hoping to like get another national title here for the first time in 40 some years. And it sucks for like the national audience who, like, every time you turn on the television, there is JuJu Watkins. Like if it's a State Farm commercial, if it's a Nike or Gatorade or whatever it is, like she is ever present in the American pop culture landscape. And so people know who she is. And I realize like that doesn't diminish what happens to other people, but she's a star, right? And losing out on a star matters not just for the basketball, it matters for the tournament itself. And I believe that there are plenty of other women's basketball players who can carry that mantle in terms of an on-court perspective. Like I think there's still gonna be really good basketball in this tournament. But yeah, there's just too many names on this ACL list. And like, I live in Los Angeles and Cameron Brink just tore her ACL last year. And there has to be like some understanding of why this is happening, I think, at a higher rate on the women's basketball side and the women's sports side. And, there's like so many books that are just like, yeah, well, up until like 20 years ago, the research didn't even account for the fact that women menstruate. And it's like, that seems like a pretty big deal that like you'd have to account for, in terms of designing studies about female athletes. So hopefully like there's more effort put into this, considering what a growth property women's basketball is. Like just economically, you'd want to be able to protect your athletes. So ideally, as the sport continues to grow, the science is also another part of it that continues to develop.
Yeah, there's so many aspects of it when you think about the sport growing. It's not just the sport, the media, it's the actual treatment facilities and the research and all of that as well. We talked a little bit about Paige, and I mean, last night UConn won their game and they're going to the Sweet 16. And I mean, not to put JuJu's injury kind of in this like harsh, but like UConn's path kind of becomes a little bit easier when you actually think about the actual on-court dynamics of it all. But last night, Paige became the first player to achieve a 50, 40, 90 shooting season. So, if you're not familiar with that stat, it's 50% from the field, 40% from three, and 90% from the free throw line. But she was also the first college basketball player, and I think I saw NBA and WNBA player to do that while also leading the league in an assist to turnover ratio. So just like a lot of stats for people who are like really into the basketball junkie of it all. But other than that, and just like her level of playing, what impact do you think that Paige Bueckers has had? I mean, we're coming to the end of her college career. She's assumed to hopefully go into the WNBA draft. so she still has a big career ahead of her, but what impact do you think in her 5 years at UConn has she had on women's basketball?
It's a tough question because UConn itself is such a brand that impacts women's basketball. And I feel like, not to, diminish Paige by any means, but there is a certain just expectation of stars there. And people who don a UConn jersey have an outsized ability to impact women's basketball because the focus is going to be on them. But you think about where the game was when Paige got to college, and we just suffered the pandemic canceled tournament, which was highly anticipated, right? Like, could Oregon win its first national title, right? Like, a lot of potential storylines going into that. And there was a real like feeling of loss and a gap, like not just in college basketball, obviously, but all across the world and the sports world. And what Paige was able to do in her freshman season, putting together that National Player of the Year campaign in her first season, really just dazzling people during the tournament in that Final Four run, I think just was sort of a reminder of like, hey, we did miss one tournament. Yes, maybe the games look a little different here in this closed environment in San Antonio, but we still have another UConn story. Like, things are things are kind of still coming back to normal. You can still count on somebody wearing the Huskies jersey to perform in an outsized, like, impressive way. And I think that mattered, right? Like, her being able to just move like the sport forward as if nothing like was really happening, and we could still continue to experience UConn in college basketball the way we had before the pandemic. And her career has had its ups and downs. She was definitely not fully healthy when they made the national title game in 2022. And UConn itself was like just completely ravaged that season when they played in the tournament and during the regular season. But the way she's been able to come back, putting together the senior season, which was better than any of our previous seasons. And this fifth year season is obviously, arguably even better than the previous ones too. But the consistency, right? The way that she like always shows up, big games, the Final Four performance, or the Elite Eight performance, I should say, against USC last year, like sort of, we're still UConn, even the great game that they gave against Iowa last year in the Final Four. I think Paige gets put in so many of these big showcase moments, and her ability to, UConn's not going to win all of those games. That's just not the way basketball works anymore. But her ability to at least put her team in position to succeed is really impressive. And, it's just a good thing for basketball that there has been like this talismanic player who can like absorb all of this energy and, handle the spotlight and do good things with it, right? Like, I think about her SB speech in 2021 all the time of how she wanted to use her platform to highlight Black women as opposed to, her being recognized. And I think the way she's carried herself and the way she's used her influence has been really important. So yeah, it's just a really good figure for college basketball, I think, right? Like, she's fun to watch. Like, obviously people love tracking her. Like, that's like a nice little parlor game the women's basketball fans can have. And she's really good. So, I think her arc has just been like everything you'd want from a prominent college basketball player.
Yeah, I think one thing that I really impresses me about her, especially when you think about her age, is the fact that I saw, probably last year, that she has a stipulation in all of her NIL deals that there has to be some sort of like giving back aspect to the deals that she makes. And I think that's just like a testament to the person that she is and the person that she wants to be and what she wants to do with her influence. And, I think when we think about athletes now becoming a more celebrity than I think, they always have been in a sense, but women's athletes especially becoming more celebrity than they have in previous years. I think having someone like Paige kind of at the forefront of that and be a part of that first big wave of the women's sports movement that we saw, in the past like 5 years. So I'm definitely excited to see how she translates that to the WNBA.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I read a great story yesterday about how Paige has been cooking breakfast for her Muslim teammate Jana Al-Alfi, right, during Ramadan, so that like she only has to worry about getting up, right, and then fasting during the day, and Paige takes care of like the actual breakfast part of it, which is just like a really lovely gesture, right? And nice thing to do for a teammate that is in her freshman season, like celebrating Ramadan as a college athlete, basically for the first time away from her family. And apparently Paige makes really good scrambled eggs. Like, that's what I learned from the story. So just another example of her, like uplifting like her teammates of color, right? And just doing a good thing for people who need a hand.
Yeah. And not only that, but just like leading by example for her other teammates as well. Like I heard there's already KK Arnold already like volunteered to do it next year now that Paige is leaving. So yeah, just that aspect as well. So last week on your podcast, you kind of predicted that there would be no surprises or shocks in the March Madness tournament. Your co-hosts were kind of like jabbing you for that. But do you still have that opinion going into the Sweet 16?
Well, I will say that what happened in LA last night was a pretty big shock. So
Sure.
I was wrong.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual seeded teams that have made the Sweet 16, I think the lowest one that we're dealing with is number 5, right?
Yep.
So, not a lot of shocks in terms of the actual teams that have made the Sweet 16. The biggest upset that has happened is a 5 over a 4. So, that's, to me, that makes for some really fun basketball in the second round. Like, I want to see the best teams in the country play against one another, especially ones that haven't already had matchups during the regular season. So, like Oklahoma, UConn, the Reagan Beers Bowl. Reportedly UConn was her second choice school when she was coming out of the portal. Stoked about that. I look at TCU, Notre Dame. That is a rematch of a regular season game, but if it happened outside of the contiguous U.S., does it really count?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one I'm looking forward to, especially with a healthier Notre Dame team.
Mm-hmm.
You think about what's the 2-3 in that? NC State, LSU. Again, actually, a lot of these are rematches. That's a rematch. UCLA Baylor's a rematch. Duke, North Carolina. I think everyone but Oklahoma, UConn, and USC, Kansas State are rematches now that I think about it. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of teams that are playing really well at this particular moment. Like, the way LSU's offense has just exploded, especially against Florida State. Same with NC State's offense against Michigan State. You think about the way, Kansas State has looked since Ayoka Lee came back over the last 2 games, and just that incredible performance they put up against Kentucky in the second round. So there's a lot to like in terms of how these teams are playing. Like I said, I did not predict chalk throughout the entire tournament. I said just during the first round, and I feel validated in that. So I'm not saying that every 1 seed is going to make the Elite Eight. This is the time where things can start to happen, especially now that we get to neutral sites. But I'm just glad that we have, I look at the field and there aren't a lot of teams where I think I wish they were still in this part of the bracket. Obviously Alabama, Kentucky played awesome games in the second round. And if they had different opponents, maybe they would still be at this point. But, you think about the whole arc of the regular season and these are the teams I was most interested in. These are the teams that I want to see what they can do with the highest stages. And so I'm really glad that we were getting this opportunity.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Let's kind of flip into WNBA talk now, just to end off the podcast. So obviously we go straight from March Madness basically into the WNBA draft, which is a whirlwind for all of us, but ultimately
no offseason, Chelsea.
No offseason. Yeah, exactly. It's great though, in a sense, because the hype of March Madness kind of just bleeds into the WNBA season. And I think one of the great phenomenons that has kind of grown as parity in women's college basketball has grown is this idea that a player can really show off during March Madness and therefore be given that chance to be drafted into the WNBA, to make a roster, and all of that. So do you think so far, I mean, we still have kind of the most elite matchups to come in March Madness, but have you seen any glimpses of players that you think are raising their own draft stock so far in the tournament?
It's tough in the WNBA to have these risers because you have so much tape on them, right? It's not like in the NBA where you could have a one and done freshman and they've been middling over the course of the regular season, and then for 6 games or whatever during March they explode. There's 4 years of tape, 5 years of tape on a lot of these players. So if WNBA talent evaluators are meaningfully changing their opinions of players based on March, one, I question your process. 2, I don't think it's really happening. So, put that aside, I think there are some players who can at least, cement their cases a little bit. I think what Sabreena Sandell has been able to do for Kansas State, player who probably not considered a first round pick, but 6 foot plus point guard who's just super efficient with the ball and can hit threes.
Yeah.
Why wait for that? And has done a good job defensively. I think she's a player who, might be teetering on that early second round area for a WNBA draft. Who else I think who has helped their stock in terms of Cheyenne Sellers has had some injuries over the course of the season, but being able to perform the way she did against Alabama, and if she can put together a good game against South Carolina, I think that can help ease some concerns at least for WNBA teams. And she's definitely a player who has the talent, who has the capability to get into the first round. I thought actually no, those were more juniors who could be just helping their cases for next year, but that happens too. Zia James wasn't really on our national radar until what she was able to do in March last year. So, like, maybe she wasn't a riser in the traditional sense that, like, she got to go into the draft right away, but it was the March Madness experience that, like, made people realize, "Oh, hey, Zia James, that's a scoring guard who could potentially succeed in our league." So, maybe we'll
Yeah.
see more things like that, where at least there's still an additional year of tape, for them to put on the
Yeah.
WNBA draft radar. But, I think people like Emily Engstler, let's say, who in 2022, I would say, like, really sort of leapt into the consciousness with her tournament performance at Louisville. And that, again, because, she played at Syracuse and hadn't really had an opportunity to be in the postseason much before that. So, I think those are kind of the exception that proves the rule, but it is always fun when that happens because people love the tournament and they love to root for people who did well in the tournament to, continue their careers in whatever way possible.
Yeah. Another thing is that we've seen so much like turnaround this free agency in the WNBA, and we're going to see even more next year. But in terms of these teams that we have for this season, is there any one of these like revamped teams that you're really excited to see the product of?
In the WNBA, well, at the risk of being a total homer, I am very excited to see what the Sparks look like. Getting a guard in Kelsey Plum, who is as good as any guard they've had, much better, I should say, than any guard they've had since Chelsea Gray left after the 2020 season. So that is pretty much number one on my list. I am fascinated by what the Atlanta Dream are going to look like. I thought they sort of started to figure out what their identity was going to be at the end of the regular season with that lineup of Canada, Howard, Alicia Gray, Naz Hillman, and Tina Charles. And, when you get the opportunity to get Brittany Griner and Bree Jones, you go for it. But that does meaningfully change what they're going to look like, not to mention the fact that they've hired Carl Semesco, who is presumably going to have an entirely new system from what they were running with Nisha Wright. So, that team, just like as a science experiment, I'm really excited about because, how do these two bigs work together? How does that all work with presumably up-tempo offense that you're bringing from Florida Gulf Coast? Like, what does that look like defensively? Can they be mobile enough? I have so many questions, but I love all of the talent there, and I'm betting on, Ryan Howard and Alicia Gray to just be really good all-star level players and make things work out there. So, Atlanta really at the top of my list in terms of just I have so many ideas about what this could look like, and I really don't know what direction it's going to take.
True, yeah. And I feel like these teams have such a short window going into next season with, all the free agency going to happen. But that's a conversation for a later day. But that kind of comes to the end of the time that we have here. Thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about, the new podcast and everything, and excited to keep listening. But where else other than No Offseason can the people find you?
Yeah, so other than the audio on No Offseason, all of my written work is at theathletic.com, and I am on Blue Sky at Sabreena JM. So that's where I get to have all of my women's basketball musings.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And for Locked On Women's Basketball, I'm Chelsea Late. We'll see you tomorrow.